So I guess we find ourselves once again in this difficult time, hoping that next year we won't be here. The reality is that we are still here, and so we've heard the same thoughts and same ideas over and over. It's almost like what can we do different? I think it's not a question of what we do different. I think it's a question of what we do more and what we do better of. And so the title of the talk, I know it might be a little bit challenging of a title, but it's called The Danger of Chesed. And I say that with a qualification because when I say the dangers of Chesed, so that might come across as, well, maybe Chesed is a bad thing. I think it's just the contrary. I think if we understand the dangers of Chesed, means that we understand the outer limits of what Chesed should bring us to. And right where we reach that point where it's now out of the limits, it helps us appreciate what the limitations actually are. And so by understanding the dangers of something, you actually understand what that thing is. And that's what I hope to convey today with Hashem's help. So let's dig in. It's the famous Gemara that we're all familiar with. The Gemara says that, excuse me, I should have a glass of water, but the Gemara says, what's the difference between the reason why the first and the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed? The Gemara says that the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed because we committed the three cardinal sins of forbidden relationships, we committed murder, and we committed idolatry. And as a result of those great sins, the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. The second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, the Gemara says, was because of baseless hatred, sinas chinam, that the Jews were quarreling and fighting. As a consequence, the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, incidentally, on the same day in history, which was yesterday. And we mourn that loss today. So the Mepharshim ask a question. The Maharal asks, he says, is it just coincidental that the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed for 3 reasons, and the second Beis HaMikdash for 1, and that this 1 is equal to all 3? Are these just very severe sins that we talk about, that specifically because of these? And even if you want to say that it's just because of the severity of the sin, by the first Beis HaMikdash, why did we need specifically those 3? Is idolatry not sufficient? Is murder not sufficient, or forbidden relationships? What's unique about specifically the unity of those 3 as a package that caused the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, and in contrast to the second Beis HaMikdash? And so the Maharal says something, a very brief statement, but the Mepharshim tried to explain what the Maharal is talking about. The Maharal says a very interesting thing. He says that the first Beis HaMikdash stood in the merit of the Jewish people inheriting the 3 qualities from the Avos. Namely, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, each one epitomized one great quality. Avraham epitomized the midah of Chesed. Yitzchak was din and gvura, and Yaakov was emes and tiferes. Simply translated, Yaakov represented loving kindness and compassion. Yitzchak represented judgment and din. And Yaakov epitomized emes, which is truth, which is seeing godliness in everything, in all of creation. And he says that when they sinned with those 3 sins, they broke down, so to speak, the foundations upon which the Beis HaMikdash was built, and therefore there was no longer a merit for it to exist. And the explanation is as follows. Chaim Friedlander in the Sifsei Chaim tries to elaborate what exactly is the connection between the 2. And he explains that each of the Avos had that quality, actually inherited a spiritual DNA into subsequent generations. And we continue to have that. We continue to be compassionate people. We continue to be very loyal to judgment and due process and the legal system. And we are also very much into truth and understanding the truth of the nature of the world. And these qualities we inherited from the Avos. And he says that the connection between each are the following. And I'll go from the easiest to the more difficult. The easiest one to appreciate is Yitzchak. Yitzchak was din, was judgment. The Jewish people inherited the quality of being judgmental in din. But they took that quality and they went the wrong way with it. They used that power of judgment, of justice, and they perverted it into judging people and their life, and therefore causing murder and death. They took a quality which was good, and they perverted it into the evil. And then they lost that pillar of the Beis HaMikdash. Yaakov represented emes. What is the emes of Yaakov? What is the emes? Emes, truth, is when you see in all of creation and all of mankind a unified purpose for the service of God. And that is what Yaakov epitomized. The Mefarshim say that the stones that gathered together as one under Yaakov's head was a representation of all of creation being solely for the purpose of God. And Yaakov brought that message into the world of recognizing that everything has a pure value in the spiritual sense. When the Jewish people took that quality of goodness and truth in the world, and they perverted it into idolatry, they in essence took a quality that saw good in everything and said, hey, even that must have a quality for good. Even that must have a quality of connection. But obviously that's a perversion because they disconnected the emes from the source. Therefore they lost the second pillar. And that's why the Beis HaMikdash had fallen two parts. Now the third pillar is the difficult one to understand. The third pillar is Abraham, who represented Chesed. And the Jewish people who inherited the midah of Chesed, that midah was perverted when the Jewish people used the midah of Chesed for forbidden relationships. What does one have to do with the other? How does Chesed have an outgrowth into forbidden relationship and sinful union? To make the question a little bit more difficult, specifically if you look in the Torah, we read this parsha on Yom Kippur, we read it at Mincha. We read about the different sinful unions, the arayot. And specifically, I'll read you the pasuk when it talks about the relationship, the forbidden relationship between a brother and a sister. The pasuk says like this: "V'ish asher yikach es achoso." When a man takes his sister, bas aviv or bas imo, whether it's from the father or the mother, v'ra es arvasa v'hi tira es arvaso, and they see each other, which means that they unite. Says the Torah, what is wrong with that union? Chesed hu. That is a union of chesed, and therefore v'nichretu le'enei b'nei amam, and therefore they should be cut off from the Jewish people. Very strange terminology. I mean, I think we've all seen this. Chesed hu, the union of a brother and a sister, is described as a union of chesed. How could that be? What is chesed about that? That's disgraceful. That's disgusting. So again, what is it about Abraham's chesed that the Jewish people perverted? And what is it that by erva, by the arayas, between the connection between a brother and sister, which we describe as chesed? And so just to top off the questions, to appreciate the dynamic here, is that the Mechtav Melio quotes the Chatam Sofer, and he says the following. Chatam Sofer says that only by Avram Havinu do we find the terminology Magen Avraham, right? We read the Shemana Esrei, and we read the end of the first bracha. We see that God had to protect Avraham, Magen Avraham. We don't find that by Yitzchak, and we don't find that by Yaakov. So Chassam Sofer says, what is unique about Avraham that he needed a special protection? Says the Chassam Sofer, because Avram Avinu had the attribute which was the most dangerous of all three. He had the attribute of chesed, of compassion, of kindness. And therefore God needed to protect him more than anyone else so that his kindness and chesed stays in the right check, in the right place, and is manifest in the appropriate manner. Again, chesed, how can chesed be dangerous? Why does God have to protect the chesed of Avraham Avinu? What's unique here? What exactly is going on? If we want to understand, if we fast forward and talk about the byproduct of dangerous chesed, Lot, who was Avraham Avinu's nephew, lived with Avraham in his home, who experienced the aura of living amidst a person who was truly devoted to the world. And such a Lot who grew up with the understanding, the paradigm of chesed, moves to stone, tries to do chesed, brings guests into his home, despite the law against it, punishable by death. And in the event where he is discovered, and he has the guests in his home, and the mob is knocking on the door, begging to kill or take away these men, what does Lot say? He says, please, out of compassion, leave these men alone. Take my 2 unmarried daughters instead and do with them as you please. That is a perversion of chesed. The Chachamim explain that Lot's chesed was an outgrowth of Avraham's. Lot's chesed was an outgrowth of Avraham's because he perverted that which Avraham had mastered. What exactly is going on here? How can we talk about these 2 things? Another one I'll throw out is Yishmael. Chazal say, if you read the Psukim, that Yishmael also grew up in a home with such a person. And he took those same attributes and used them for theft and also for forbidden relationships. So I think we've broadened the question enough that now we can start delving into a perspective to understand what is it about compassion and chesed and kindness that can sometimes go in the wrong way. And I think it starts with understanding what exactly chesed is. What is the mitzvah of chesed? There's a very serious question that it's brought down in halacha that seems to undermine the whole concept of bein adam l'chavero and how we treat other people. If we were to basically put the question out there, I know that for myself, we have a responsibility to work on our nature, on our midos. We should always run away from honor. We should look to be humble. We shouldn't indulge ourselves in the physicalities of this world, always looking for the next good meal or the next nice piece of clothing to wear, always looking for what other people have. We should always look to be satisfied with what is necessary for our life, sameach b'chelko, and we should always look to temper our nature and our personality. Don't look for honor, don't look for desire. That's how we're supposed to live. Now here's the question. If that's what I'm supposed to do, and every Jew is supposed to strive for these levels of growth, then how does the midah of chesed tell me to do exactly the opposite? The midah of chesed tells me, go to that person and give him tremendous honor so that he may possibly become a very arrogant person. Go buy that same steak that you've been dreaming about, but you don't really need it. Buy 2 of them and give it to your neighbor and roast it on the grill and make it just like he likes it and serve it to him while giving him a foot massage, right? Chesed tells us to do all the things we're not supposed to do for ourselves, go do it for another person. What's the problem with this? The problem is that there's a halacha that says, Lifnei iver lo titein mechshol. You cannot put a stumbling block in front of a blind person. We all know that if a person is presumably eating a kosher meal and you slip in non-kosher, you're putting a stumbling block because you're causing a person to sin. If that's the case, by a lot of halacha that we talk about, then why specifically, when it comes to midos, and it comes to bein adam l'chaveru, it seems like all of those laws have fallen away, and now I can put all of the stumbling blocks in front of you, and it doesn't matter what the consequence will be. That's a good question. So, I'm not going to directly answer the question, but I'll tell you what Rabbi Yisrael Salanter held. He was the founder of the Musar movement, and he said the following statement, and then we'll clarify. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter is quoted as saying, I think it's in Ar Yisrael, he says, someone else's olam hazeh is your olam haba. Somebody else's gashmias is your ruchnias. And in essence, all of the rules that apply to a person in their own personal self-development completely is opposite when you're dealing with other people. And you should always go out of your way to find any possible benefit you can have for another person, in any way possible. Just reminds me, by the way, when we say by the Birchos HaShachar in the morning, most of the brachos that we say are in plural, right? Hamechi mitzadei gaver, God prepares the steps of man. Nosen layaev koach, He gives the weak energy. You go through each one of them. There's one which is very strange. It's written in the singular. And what is it? She'asa li kol tzarki. That God did for me all of my needs. So the first ask, why doesn't it say who does for us all of our needs? Right? He gives everything else in the plural. There's two sets of the brachos, but in the main set, which is in the plural, there's one which stands out. Why do we say that did for me all that I need? So I saw a beautiful pshat. It says that the philosophy of God did for me everything I need only applies to me. It does not apply to another person. Meaning to say, imagine another person is having a difficult time, right? So then we open up the siddur and it says, hey, God does for all of us that which is good for us. I'm sorry, but you're in the exact situation you need to be, sir. You can just be fine. Say Chazal, don't read that pasuk wrong. Sha'as Ali, when it comes to you, when you got a problem, accept the dimna shamayim. But when it comes to Yedam, when it comes to the other person, you must do everything in your power to try to alleviate that challenge. To make it even more poignant, to bring the point out, I think the Kutzker says, don't quote me or him on this, but I think the Kutzker says, every attribute that a person has can be used for the positive or for the negative. Any tendency that we have has a dual purpose. So he asks, there's an innate nature for a person to be a non-believer, a kofar. God forbid, as if they don't believe in God. There's a tendency in man for that. Says the Kutzker, where does that energy manifest itself in the positive? How can you ever have such a thing? Says the Kutzker, he says, when it comes to somebody else's needs, you must act as if there's no God. What does that mean? It means that you must go out of your way to do everything humanly possible within your hands and not say, okay, God is going to take care of that person. God, kavyachal, chas v'shalom, has to, as if not be in the picture when it comes to your responsibility relative to another person. Of course, we daven. That's part of the ishtadlus. And of course, we have to believe that God is the one ultimately going to bring the refuah. But in terms of my responsibility, I cannot stop with the boundaries that I think are what should be. If that is what chesed is, there's two levels of chesed, by the way. I saw in a sefer a beautiful description of two types of people who do chesed. So there's the convenient chesed people, and then there's the inconvenient chesed people. What's the difference? I can tell you, when I read this, I laughed at myself. But the convenient chesed person is a person where we're all sitting for dinner or a meal, and then you have a salty food, and you become thirsty. So you get up and you want to go get a drink. And you realize, hey, I'm getting a drink. Hey, does anybody else want a drink too? Anybody thirsty? Right? That's a convenient chesed. Because you have a need, and you're like, well, okay, I'm going anyway. I may as well get everybody else a drink too. Right? So we get up, and we get 5 drinks. So we're bal chesed, of course. That's a convenient chesed. That's an outgrowth of my personal need. What's a greater level of chesed? Is the person who's sitting at the meal, he's fine. He's not even thirsty, or even has a drink, looks around and notices that other people don't have any drinks, so he says, maybe they're thirsty. Can I get a drink for anyone? Same action, totally different motivation. One is a byproduct of my world. The second is a byproduct of other people's world. Avraham Avinu epitomized the truest sense of chesed, and that Avraham Avinu was ready to live for others completely. We talk about him bringing lowly idol worshippers into his home, and he goes and he slaughters his priciest, expensive calves just to give 2 different tongues with mustard, so that he can serve them with the greatest pleasure. You think Avraham Avinu was having tongue dinner every night? I don't think so. He went beyond, and he gave them. Stone. What was going on? Stone was a city of murderers. They used to cut people's legs off because their feet were too long for the bed. And what do we find? Avraham Avinu, the first Jewish lawyer, is arguing with God to save a city of sinful people. Wow. Chesed. By the way, I want you to understand, this is a halacha that's brought down. When we talk about hating Rishayim, when we talk about hating evil people, Chazal is very clear. We don't hate any person. We hate the deeds of a person. Because if we hate people innately, and we're constantly thinking about what we don't like, then we become hateful people as well. Because Adam Nifal Kafi Pulasa, a person becomes that which is constantly on his mind. We don't hate people. We hate people's actions. That's a good educational tip as well. We should always make sure we focus on the action of a child, not on the child himself. Not, why are you doing that? Sorry. You are such a lazy person, right? And we label a person. We don't label people. We say, hey, you're not a lazy person, so why are you doing something that a lazy person would do? Label the action, not the person. So when we talk about true chesed, we talk about what my willingness is to go beyond the boundaries. What's the difference between the word tzaddik and chassid? What is the difference between a tzaddik and a chassid? A tzaddik, by the way, in this definition will be a little different than what we're used to saying. A tzaddik is a person who only does what he has to do. He follows the letter of the halacha and that's it. That's a tzaddik. A chassid is a person who breaks free from that boundary, who goes beyond the call of duty, beyond the letter of the law. The word chesed itself is an interesting word. I saw this once, I don't remember where I saw it, but the word chesed comes from the word chas, dal. Dalid is really dal. The word dal means someone who's downtrodden, someone who's lacking. Chas is to have compassion and mercy. So chesed does not describe an action, it describes an emotion. It describes my emotional reaction to somebody who's in a difficult situation. That is chesed. Chesed is being able to connect with a person and feeling that pain and compassion. But when that emotion, that reaction is not controlled or guided, then you can lead a person to doing the most terrible things. That's how you can get a lot who's brought up in a house which epitomizes, I must do what is good for other people, to the extent where it even jeopardizes my own family. By the way, the halachas of chesed dictate that chesed starts at home, right? How many times are we willing to give the ride or host the couple or the family and all of the things that we think are such great chesed, and we think that the sacrifice we put on the rest of our family and the attention is actually a worthwhile thing. It's very clear in halacha that chesed starts at home. But you can appreciate that when we don't follow the guidelines of what chesed asks of us, we can pervert it into doing things that we would call chesed, but ultimately are not. So that is the first stage of understanding the dangers of chesed, is appreciating what chesed is. If we live chesed to the extreme of what is asked of us, to go into another person's world, to the extent where I am living a life where I wish would have, but give that to another person, that's the true chesed. But if it's unguided, then it could lead to very difficult consequences. So that explains lot. But how does chesed come to sinful relationships? Why does the Torah say that that union is chesed, right? It's similar. And I saw a beautiful point brought from Rabbi Gans, Moshe Gans' father, in one of his books. It's a beautiful idea. Actually, no, it was on one of his Parsha sheets. He says the following. He says, if you look at the story of the Benos Midian, after the Jewish people had left and Bilam unsuccessfully cursed the Jewish people, they couldn't find a way to penetrate. He says, you know how we're going to get them? Let's get them commit sinful acts. Let's get them to commit those difficult sins, and therefore their God will then serve his wrath upon them. So what was the plan? The Medrash goes in detail. So what do? They set up like a shuk, with the little wares, and everyone had their own table, and they put old women at the front tables, showing the wares, right? So the Jewish men were walking through the village, and this old cricket says, "Hello, Sonny, would you like to buy some clothing?" Guy looks at it, said the quality's not so great. He's thumbing through some of it. So she looks at him and she says, "Well, if you want, we have a lot better merchandise. We keep it in the back. Do you mind checking in?" I said, "Okay, old lady, what's the merchandise? What could be so bad?" He goes inside, and we all know what happens, right? He walks inside. All of a sudden, the young daughter walks out, and she's dressed, very provocatively, trying to entice him, gives him a little wine, and all of a sudden, we know what happens after. But the Medrash gives an amazing insight to what actually transpired there. The Medrash makes it very clear that they were not able to get the men to sin purely by trying to entice them physically. I'm going to read you what the Medrash says. It's a fascinating Medrash. So this was the argument that the women used. So here we go. So they looked at these men, and they saw that they were not falling for it, and they said like this, "Why is it that we love you and that you hate us? Take the item for free. We are all descendants of the same person. We are all the same family. Terach, Avraham, the father of Avraham. Do you not wish to eat from our sacrifices and cooking? We have cows and chickens. Slaughter them according to your laws and eat them." In other words, they were saying, don't reject us. Be humane. Be a humanitarian. If we love you and we care about you, then you should unite with us. Oh. Now they struck the Rahmanas chord of a Jew. When it was the Taiva court, the Jews could control. But once it came to, hey, are you being cruel? Are you being inhumane? We're such kind and good people. Look at what we do. And you're going to reject us? That's not fair. That's not nice. Now they broke down and they said, wow, that seems like a good argument. How can I reject a person? It's so insulting. It's so inhumane. And therefore they went and they committed the most difficult and terrible of acts. How does chesed lead to sin? Very simple. When we look at the other person in the terms of a relationship or in terms of any deed, and there's an emotional relationship connected to that, and there's a possible rejection, then there's an element of cruelty. And when there's an element of cruelty, it breaks down all the boundaries because we all want to be accepted. We all want to be kind and caring because that's the midah that we inherited from Avraham Avinu. And when that trait is exploited, then yes, the union of a brother and sister can be an outgrowth of chesed. Because chesed doesn't mean tzaddik, chesed means chasidus, going beyond the boundaries. Those boundaries can be very dangerous at times. Hence, you have a Yishmael. Hence, you have a Yishmael that's an outgrowth of an Avraham Avinu. Now, did Avraham Avinu fail? No, he didn't. What Lot and Yishmael inherited naturally as a byproduct of their environment, Avraham Avinu worked to prove that he had the quality inherent to himself. What were all of the tests of Avraham Avinu? If you think about it, it's mind-boggling. Here you have a person who's genuinely compassionate and caring, and every single one of his tests is a challenge to his basic nature. Avraham Avinu, get up, leave your family. Leave your your parents, who probably need you. Leave the community that's been supported by you. Just leave them. But that's cruel. That's what God wants. Leave. Take your son, mutilate him on a very sensitive part of his body. That's cruel. I'm a kind person. Commit it. And he did. Take your son, Yishmael, the one you love. Kick him out of the house and give him barely any food. That's cruel. He committed the act. And the ultimate act to prove his true, genuine chesed, to prove that Avraham Avinu's chesed was not just an emotional byproduct of the immediate, when he was willing to put his son on the altar and sacrifice him. Avraham Avinu's midah of chesed was in check. And that's why we were zocheh to inherit that from Avraham Avinu. Why am I talking about this? Well, I think it's important because now we understand and appreciate where chesed needs to go, but also where it needs to stop. If I live a life purely for what I see in the need of other people, then I can live a tremendously holy life. But it has to be within the guidelines and framework of Torah. It's relevant specifically to this day and age. I think Rav Moshe Feinstein coined the terminology that America is the Malchus Shel Chesed. Right? We've heard this. Apparently, the Rabbi also said it, that America is the Malchus of Chesed. That's a tremendous opportunity because the world has learned ethics and morality and the value of man and the protection of human rights from America. The world would not be the same without America. But if we understand that Chesed is a double-edged sword, then we're up for a tremendous battle of how do we define what Chesed actually is and how do we know when it's not. You know, I always have a problem with, forgive me for saying this, with Aladdin, right? You know, we think it's like a harmless cartoon. But we connect emotionally to that child who has no food or no parents and feel that because he has no food to eat, all of a sudden it's okay for him to steal. God is still to eat, God to eat to steal, right? Know the song, right? And we connect with that because it's okay. That's a chesed. Let the kid go. No one's going to eat it. You know, Chazal say that if a poor man whose family is starving at home is walking by the treasury of the greatest, wealthiest man who has these storage houses of gold coins, and one gold coin happens to slip from under the door, and he sees it, and he picks it up and justifies, this man will never know that this coin ever even existed, and I can bring food to my family for the next month. Compassion would say, take the coin. The Torah would say, put the coin back and be hungry for another few weeks. How do we deal with this challenge? Is the Torah cruel? Is the Torah asking for us to go against our base nature when we're up against this conflict of American society and the world at large that tells us to be one way in the name of humanity? And we feel at times that we need to justify ourselves and say, wait, that's just the way the Torah is. The Torah is a little bit more strict. It's a little bit more cruel. I have to say it, but I'm sorry. Is that the response? Is that how we will defend ourselves? And this is what I would like for us to take away from today. How do we have the tools in a world where chesed is very difficult to define and chas v'shalom leads to the most difficult atrocities that we experience in our lives today? How do we defend our Torah values? What is a tool that we can use? So I'd like to answer with a fascinating medrash. Fascinating medrash, it's one line. But if we get this line and we make it part of us as who we are, we will have a very strong defense that we can use for ourselves and also educate our families and our children with. Medrash says a line. I'll read it in the Medrash Lashon and then I'll translate. Medrash in Koheles says, Kol mi shenasa rachman b'makom achzari. When a person becomes a compassionate person at a time when he should have been cruel, so in the end, that person, nasa achzari b'makom rachman, he himself will become a cruel person in place of becoming a compassionate person. Says the Medrash in Koheles, if you are kind where you're supposed to be cruel, then you will be much more cruel in the future at a time when there should have been kindness. He says this is an immutable law of human condition, that when we are narrow-sighted, and we only see the immediate cruelty of a situation, and we make decisions based on that scenario, we are not being kind. We are actually being very cruel. I'll give you a mashal. I saw Rabbi Gans brought this mashal too. I'll give you a beautiful mashal. A guy's got an infection on his foot, a terrible disease. They wheel him into the hospital, it's very late, and for whatever reason, they didn't have the anesthetics. The doctor looks at the leg and he identifies this terrible disease. And the only way for this person to be able to survive is to remove the leg. He looks for the anesthetic, he doesn't find it. He looks for the knife to use, it's dull-edged. And he's thinking, oh my God, this is going to be extremely painful. We've got to tie this guy down and cut his leg off. Sorry if I'm being too graphic. And the doctor is there with the knife, and he sees the leg, and he stands up and he says, I will not do surgery on this man, because it is cruelty to put him through this much pain. And he puts the knife down, and he storms out of the room. Now I ask, is he a kind person, or is he a very, very cruel person? Any comments? Well, he basically just murdered that person. Kindness is not defined by a fuzzy, warm feeling that I get right in the immediate in front of me. That leg being removed painfully is the greatest act of kindness you can do to that person. We only appreciate that is because we see the full picture. Our Torah is deracheh darchei noam. Every aspect of our Torah is kindness and compassion. How do I know that? Well, I'm in good company. The Ramban in the Ghermezian Kodesh was responding to a question that he had received. The Ramban was asking, he says, it seems a little inhumane for us to slaughter animals for our pure pleasure. That we should kill animals that have families and they're happy and they play. We slaughter them to eat them and ingest them ourselves? Does this seem humane? Does it seem right? Good question. I think it's a very good question. Now, by the way, I like vegetarianism. I'm not here to talk about the health benefits of doing that. I'm talking about a specific philosophy which says that the rights of the animal should exist and I should have no right to eat it. That's what the Ramban is coming to address. So what does the Ramban answer? Listen to what he says. The Ramban says, if you have this question, you need to look at the pasuk in the Torah. The Torah says, Tov Hashem lakol, v'rachamav al kol ma'asav. God is good to everything, v'rachamav, and His mercy is upon all of His creations. Al kol ma'asav. And says the Ramban, if you see this scenario and you think that it looks cruel to your eyes, you have to recognize that there's a great benefit to an animal being consumed by a human being. Now, look at some benefit. So you have a fat belly, right? Says the Ramban, and Rav Wolbe explains this point. Just trying to bring the point out. The Ramban says, if you wanted to appreciate the perspective, he says there's a hierarchy of creation. There's the domem, there's the tzomeach, there's the chai, and then there's the medaber. You have inanimate objects, then you have vegetation, then you have animal species, and then you have the human. The purpose of man is ultimately to engage in the world and use it to benefit the growth of a human individual and benefit the development of mankind. When each stage of creation is elevated to benefit the higher form, it is fulfilling its purpose. And therefore, this might be difficult to appreciate, but when an animal is left uneaten, but he's given to a human being to consume, in order for him to have the energy and the qualities to be able to successfully function as a human being. So some people say you could do that with vegetables. I'm not getting into the argument of that. But he says when you elevate the animal to the form of a human being, you've actually elevated him to be able to fulfill a much higher, greater purpose. To the extent where Rav Wolbe says, there's a Gemara in Pesachim. The Gemara in Pesachim says that an Amma Aretz, a layman, should not be allowed to eat meat. So Rav Wolbe says, what is going on with this pshat in the Gemara? So he says, you know what the pshat is? A layman should not eat meat, because when he eats meat and does it just purely to satisfy his stomach, then that animal died in vain. That's cruelty. But when you're dealing with a person who's growing and he's using this to elevate himself and the world around him, then there's an element of chesed. Now again, you can discuss the point, but I want to bring the pasuk out. What the Ramban is saying here is Tov Hashem lakol v'rachamav al kol ma'asav, that any action which God asks of us in the immediate might look like an act of cruelty, but in the long run, it is a greater chesed and rachamim for the world. And this is the defense that we must have as Jews. When our values are compromised, when we see that the world is coming and banging the drum of humanity, and we feel, oh, I know, I'm sorry, this is what my Torah says. No, it's not a justification. We don't need to protect ourselves. We need to feel confident that when we are cruel, when there needs to be kindness, that when people feel there should be kindness, that is truly an act of kindness. And when we give in to the immediate temptation of an environment or a situation which dictates otherwise, then we are actually committing a far greater act of cruelty. By the way, the Medrash is going on Shaul HaMelech. Because the Gemara, there's a pasuk that says, Al tiyad tzadik harba. Don't be such a tzaddik. That's what the pasuk says. It says, who's it talking about? It's talking about Shaul HaMelech. Shaul HaMelech was told to kill Amalek. And he goes, and what does he have? He has compassion. A Jewish compassion. He says, what am I going to do with the women and the children? What am I going to do with Agag? This pathetic, defeated man. He is no value. He had compassion where he should have had achzarius. And what was the consequence of allowing him to continue living? A history of suffering. A history of suffering for the Jewish people. A history of pain and suffering that is not unimaginable, that only an Amalek could be able to give. That's what the Midrash says. When you are merciful, when you need to be cruel, it will beget much greater cruelty in the future. I think we've covered all the points here. Sometimes I forget to follow my notes. But let's just review that. Let's review just to get all the points together. So we started with a question of what is unique about the first Beis HaMikdash, that it was specifically those three sins that caused the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Says the Maharal, because each one of those sins corresponded to a breakdown of a value that we inherited from our avos. Abraham gave us chesed. When we broke free from the boundaries of chesed and we used it as humanitarian justification to cause sin, then we broke down that value and we committed sinful acts of relationships. And then we committed sin and we started stealing, like a Yishmael, and doing perversions of what we call morality in the name of kindness, giving away daughters. Or all the examples that we can imagine that happen on a day-to-day basis. Yitzchak represented din. The Jewish people have a value system that gives us strict justice, and we perverted it when we use it to murder. And last, by Yaakov, we used the emes of Yaakov that was supposed to see God in everything and took the God out of it and used the Avodah Zarah for our own purposes. The dangers of an unbridled chesed, they are a mechayev, they give us a responsibility, because as Rabbi Yisrael says, my ruchnius is dependent on your gashmius. My fulfilling of every dream and desire that you have, according to halacha, of course, But my looking for your every interest, my getting you a glass of water even though I'm not thirsty, bringing tissues to the shul even though I don't have a cold for other people to use. When I look beyond my own boundaries, that is a person who's truly a chesed. But what defines our chesed, the Torah's chesed, is the guidelines that the Torah gives us for chesed. It's not what we feel or what we're exposed to in immediate. It's not the strings that are pulled in our heart at that moment that defines chesed. Because if that's the guideline, then that will actually become cruelty. I couldn't help it, but often happens when we hear about these heroic stories about, they just had it in the movie theater last week when there was a shooting, and there was a gunman who was aiming his gun towards someone else and was going to shoot the person in the head, whatever, and all of a sudden I think it was this woman dove in front of the bullet, in front of the gun, and she took the bullet for the other person. And here we're praising the heroism of such a person. Now, you might feel that's heroism, but the Gemara is very specific. The Gemara says if there's a situation where two people's lives are in danger, and there's only one flask of water in the desert, and only one can drink and survive, and they can't split it in half, the Gemara says, doesn't say give it to the other person and be a hero. It doesn't say that. The Torah says, "V'chaya achicha imach," your brother shall live with you, and by giving up the water to the other, then he's not living with you, and therefore you have an obligation to keep that flask of water for yourself. Because in the Torah's value system, who said his life is more valuable than your own, that you made that decision? An act of heroism actually could be an act of cruelty. Because if you don't have the proper structure, it's very difficult. Because, again, I'm not saying it was an heroic act, but we need to feel in our hearts when we're exposed to these situations that we have to recognize our Torah might have a different perspective. Our definitions of kindness is very different than what the world would lead us to believe. Chesed is from the word chasal, dal. It's an emotional reaction. It doesn't tell you what action to take. Although Avraham Avinu felt compassion for the people, he wasn't willing to just let them go free. He was praying on their behalf so that they could do tshuva, which is what we do for Rishai. We ask that they change their deeds. We don't label the person, except for Amalek. They have no schoskim. When we saw the humanitarian argument of the Moavi girls, it wasn't the taiva that got them in. It was their justification of be a human, be a kind, caring person. And so I want to end with a little bit of a positive note. The Gemara says, the Medrash, Abbas Rav Nosson says, that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was once traveling in Yerushalayim with Rabbi Yeshua. And they came across the site of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. And Yeshua broke down. And he says, Oy lanu al zeh shehu charav. Woe to us that this great place was destroyed. And he's very down and he's very sad. Makom shemachaprim bo avonoseinu shel Yisrael. The place where the sins of the Jewish people was machaper, was atoned for, is no longer with us. In essence, he was saying, we've lost our connection. We have no home. Our tefillas, which we daven always to the east towards Yerushalayim, because the Beis HaMikdash is the conduit for our tefillas to go to Shemayim, is gone. What's the point? There's nothing else for us to do. Why are we wasting our time? Our relationship is destroyed. We have no longer the karbanos that can bring kapara and atonement for our sins. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai looks back to Rabbi Yeshua and he says, B'ni, my son, al yira lecha. Don't be so downtrodden. Yesh lanu kapara achas shehi kamosa. We still have one form of kapara, which is the exact equivalent, which is the equivalent to the karbanos in the Beis HaMikdash. Ve'eza, what is that? Zegmilas chasadim. Doing acts of kindness. Shene'amar, as he quotes the pasuk in the Torah, Ki chesed chafatzti, because what I truly desire is chesed, is loving kindness, velo zavach, and not just sacrifices. May we merit to live a life that's just on the boundaries of dangers of chesed. That we should act with our minds, not just with the immediate situations in front of us. Define chesed for what truly is. Be compassionate and be caring and give up all of us that we have and the sacrifices necessary to be there for other people. That shall be an atonement for Hashem for us this year, and next year we'll be in Yerushalayim together.
Amen.